Today's story is about a 40-year-old cold case that is believed to have finally been solved, bringing to a close a murder mystery that has haunted a small Pennsylvania community for decades. With that being said, the offender in this story has been formally charged, but has not been found guilty and sentenced. Okay, let's go. On the morning of August 15th, 1975, 8-year-old Gretchen Harrington had set out on foot from her home in Marple Township, Pennsylvania, for what was to be the last day of summer Bible camp. Though she would have normally been accompanied by her two sisters, that day they had decided that they would rather stay home and wait for their mother to arrive. The family had recently grown by one, and their mother would soon be bringing home their new baby sister. Gretchen, however, decided to not wait for her mom and new baby sister. Instead, she had chosen to finish out her summer Bible camp for the year. Besides, she thought to herself, she would be home later in the day to meet her new baby sister anyway, so she didn't really see any reason to skip the last day of Bible camp. Gretchen's dad, Harold, knew that his daughter Gretchen was a responsible 8-year-old little girl, and he was completely confident in her abilities to venture out on this short walk alone without any deviation from the route that led to the church. Gretchen had walked this route hundreds of times with her sisters, but just to be on the safe side, and for Harold's peace of mind, he watched Gretchen walk down the sidewalk towards the church, and he did not go back inside the house until she was completely out of sight, and he couldn't see her anymore. When Gretchen arrived at the Trinity Chapel Christian Reformed Church, she knew she wouldn't be there all day. The plan for that day was to spend the morning participating in the games and activities there, and then in the late morning, at around 10:30 or 10:45-ish, it would be time to change locations and move over to the Broomall Reformed Presbyterian Church, where her dad Harold served as the pastor. The plan was that Gretchen would catch a ride with David Zandstra to the second church so that she could be there for 11 a.m. Both Gretchen and Gretchen's dad trusted David Zandstra because he was the pastor at the Trinity Chapel Church, and both Gretchen and Harold had known David for years. Later that day, as Harold was busying himself inside the Broomall Reformed Presbyterian Church, every so often he would glance at the clock. He was expecting Gretchen to come walking through the door into the church at any moment. But when 11 a.m. rolled around with no sign of Gretchen, Harold started to wonder where she was. He knew that Gretchen was not walking from one church to the next church, so he thought that maybe Pastor Zandstra might have been delayed for some reason. Harold waited for a few minutes longer, but when Gretchen still had not arrived, Harold picked up the phone and called Pastor Zandstra to find out if everything was all right and if Harold needed to go pick up his daughter. The pastor answered the phone, and after the two men exchanged their brief greetings, Harold asked him when he would be arriving with Gretchen. Pastor Zandstra fell silent for a moment. He was confused by Harold's question because Gretchen had not shown up at the church that day. And when Harold heard this, right away he hung up the phone and called the Marple Township Police to report Gretchen missing. As soon as word got out that Gretchen had vanished while she was walking to Bible camp, the entire community rallied together to help find her. A group of people came forward to say that they had seen Gretchen talking to someone in a green station wagon earlier in the day on Lawrence Road, which was the route she would have taken to the Trinity Chapel. But when this lead was investigated, it wasn't found to be of any value. Although the police and the community searched for Gretchen and the police investigated every lead they had, there was just no sign of her. 2 months later, on October 14th, 1975, a jogger was out getting some exercise in the Ridley Creek State Park when they came upon something horrifying. There, off to the side of the trail and under a bit of brush, was clearly a small human skeleton. The skeleton was so small, in fact, that there was very little doubt that it belonged to a child, and dental records would later confirm that these skeletal remains did in fact belong to Gretchen Harrington. The Delaware County coroner concluded that Gretchen had suffered serious head injuries, but since her remains were so deteriorated after having been outside in the elements for the past 2 months, there was really no way of determining if Gretchen had suffered in any other way before her death. After Gretchen's body was discovered, the investigation brought forward numerous suspects who were scrutinized by the police over the following weeks and months. But there was nothing solid to link any of them to the crime. Even though they had her body, there was still very little evidence to go on, and the leads quickly came to a standstill again. And so, because of this, the detectives were forced to file the case away pending any further developments. Once the case was filed away, decades would go by before a ghost from the past would resurface as the prime suspect in Gretchen's murder. One day, in January of 2023, a childhood friend of one of David Zandstra's daughters decided it was time and contacted the cold case detectives. She had a story to share that she thought was so unbelievable that nobody would have even listened to her if she had told anybody back in the 1970s. But now that she was older, she was ready to say what she knew. And so, there, sitting with the police officers, she told them that way back in the early 1970s, Pastor Zandstra had attempted to molest her during one of the sleepovers that his daughter was having at his house. The police sat there listening to her story as she went on to tell them that on the night that this happened, she told her friend, who was the pastor's daughter, what her father had done. Then her friend just acted like it was totally normal, even going so far as to say that he, Pastor Zandstra, does that sometimes. After telling the police this story, she then pulled out a diary that she kept when she was a child and showed the police the entry where she had written down what had happened that day. After that, she showed them another entry dated September 15th, 1975, and this entry was even more sinister and disturbing than the first one. She had written down that on 2 separate occasions, a man had tried to kidnap her friend Holly. The entry in the diary said that although she would never dare say it out loud, she believed that the would-be kidnapper was Mr. Z. Mr. Z was her secret way of writing Mr. Zandstra. And she added that she also thought that he was the one who had taken Gretchen and murdered her because she knew, even then, when she was a child, that the pastor made sure that only children seen the type of man he really was. After this woman's visit with the police, in June of 2023, Pennsylvania cold case detectives paid a visit to Mr. Zandstra, who was now 83 years old and was living in Marietta, Georgia. To their surprise, after he was confronted with these wild allegations, the former pastor, who had retired in 2005, agreed to tell them what had happened on that August morning almost 50 years ago. Mr. Zandstra began his story telling the detectives that he had spotted Gretchen walking along Lawrence Road, and seeing an opportunity, he stopped to offer her a ride. Since Gretchen knew him and trusted him completely, or at least thought she did, the little girl happily hopped into his green AMC Rambler station wagon without giving it a second thought. This would turn out to be the same green station wagon those witnesses had seen all those years ago where Gretchen was talking to the driver. But this lead that the police had in their hand was dismissed because the car belonged to a trusted member of the church, Pastor Zandstra. Once Gretchen was in the car and the door was closed behind her, there was no turning back. Instead of driving to the Bible camp, Zandstra had detoured into a wooded area where he brought the car to a stop and parked. Then they got out of the car and walked into the bushes a little ways, and when they came to a location in the woods that Zandstra thought was secluded enough, he turned to Gretchen and ordered her to remove her clothes. He explained to the police officers that this sudden perverted demand scared Gretchen, causing her to start crying, and when she refused to do what he wanted, he grabbed the 50-pound child and proceeded to repeatedly punch her in the face until he knocked her unconscious and she was bleeding from her head. At that point, Zandstra said he believed that Gretchen was dead, so he buried her body under a pile of sticks and leaves and headed off to the Trinity Chapel, where he transformed back into a beloved and trusted pastor, acting as though everything was completely normal. When he was finished telling his story, the investigators strongly suspected that much more had gone on than what he was telling, because Mr. Zandstra was able to describe in great detail the shorts that Gretchen had been wearing that day, 4 decades ago. recalling that they had a snap instead of a button above the zipper. This was also further compounded by the fact that the skeletal remains were missing clothing from the waist down. It wasn't noticed at the time, but shortly after Gretchen's murder, Pastor Zandstra and his family moved out of state. But before they moved away, standing before a packed house of mourners, including Gretchen's devastated parents, Pastor Zandstra had given the eulogy at Gretchen's funeral, knowing full well that he had beaten the little girl to death and left her alone in the woods. He had also been a shoulder to cry on for Gretchen's best friend, who was also Zandstra's own daughter. When the Delaware County District Attorney was asked to characterize Zandstra, he described him as a monster and every parent's worst nightmare. David Zandstra was finally arrested on July 17th of 2023 and is currently charged with the kidnapping and murder of Gretchen Harrington. So that's going to wrap it up for this video. If you enjoyed it, then I would say subscribe if you want, and I will see you again later.